John, welcome.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I thought it might be interesting to say a word or two about the process we went through to write this book. And we joke around about it a bit because we put a lot of intense time into it. We wrote it together. We divided up the chapters. We each wrote 5 chapters. We each reviewed the other's writing. And we're still speaking to each other, which is a wonderful thing. But it was a really good experience, I think, for both of us to take disciplined time aside to reflect on the issue and to really gather together the things we've learned that have sort of been floating out there in pieces not necessarily tied together. So the book really tries to look at the dynamics, not only of congregational life, but of racism, frankly, all of the isms in which we with which we deal, and to try to think about how the church is or is not responding to those issues. And so we're pretty direct in our critique. We really haven't held much back in our view of the topic. And we have written this book for congregations as a resource. And so the book contains exercises and opportunities for self-reflection and for group conversation in a congregational context. So that's some of the frame for what the book is. And we each applied our particular experiences. So I can perhaps begin by sharing a little bit of my personal journey, which is having grown up in white suburbia, working class suburbia, outside of Philadelphia, and really living in my white bubble very happily for quite a long period of time into my teens. And it was really once into my teens, early teens, that I began to learn about race in America by watching the evening news. Because it was for the first time where television became a primary communicator of the dynamics of race in America when you looked at the evening news and saw peaceful demonstrators being attacked by dogs and having fire hoses turned on them. So that was an awakening for me. At age 16, having at that early age already decided that I wanted to go into the ministry of the church, my minister at the time asked me if I would preach a sermon on a Sunday morning, which was one of the most terrifying prospects of my teenage years. And he said, I want you to write it yourself, but if you have a question, please come and seek me out. And I confess I knew very little about the Bible then, and so my focus was to use the Good Samaritan story in some way to talk about a message. However, in putting it together, in this sort of juxtaposition with what was top of news at the moment, I used Martin Luther King Jr. as an illustration of a Good Samaritan. And I talked about how he was advocating for the rights of all people. When I finished the sermon, well, a funny thing happened. One of my teenage friends rushed up to me and said, "You did a great job. You were able to talk for 12 minutes." So that was his measurement for success. But after all of the congregation went out the door and greeted me, I had lots of very supportive comments, and I was one of their kids, and so it was a very supportive moment, except for one person who happened to be the chair of the board of trustees of this church. And he waited till everyone else left and tore into me about using Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. as an illustration of anything good, and informed me that this was a communist who was destroying the country and rousing people to a bad end. I just had to listen because I wasn't mature enough or didn't have the tools enough to know how to respond to him. But as we stood at the door and he was firing away at me, I could see my minister busying himself, moving through the pews, picking up bulletins from the morning worship, staying in earshot of what was happening. And he let it play out a little while. And then he came up and said to the Board of Trustee chair, I think we've said enough, and I think we need to let John get on his way. But that was my first sort of realization that it was possible for me in my white bubble to not be white enough. And that is a term used by Tandeka in her research looking at racial dynamics, where she described this dynamic of not being white enough, meaning that you were acknowledging and relating to the other to such an extent that you were placing in jeopardy your white privilege and your protection by the white community regarding those privileges. And so that began my journey in dealing with these issues and looking at the world around me in a different way. So I'll stop there, Jackie, and see if you want to share a little bit of your story too.
I think my poor middle family knows my story. So just to say maybe a little bit about the way we organized the book then, that we actually did each write 5 chapters that were the most passionately calling on our individual experience, right? So John wrote Call and Commitment, the first chapter, and I think it's because of this kind of story, this origin story. Being a white man raised by a mother who taught him to love everybody and a father who was a bigot, and a grandfather who was loving, but so his own personal call and commitment. And I wrote the chapter on vision. So I'll just say a bit about that. I think I'm going to read some from it, but you know, I think we at Middle Church are so lucky, blessed. We sit in this place that I love to call an experiment, but it is like no place else ever like it. Not really. I mean, Glide Memorial in San Francisco is kind of like it, but it isn't exactly like this. Have you been there? Anybody been out there? It's wonderful. Love it. Glide Memorial in San Francisco. Beautiful community, great, incredible music, fantastic, organized, multiracial. Not exactly like this, because they're not exactly in New York. And we are also, I think, more forward about, or extroverted about our justice, right? I don't know any place else like this. And the purposefulness, the intention with which we are doing this multiracial work. Part of the reason John and I wrote the book is to teach other people, but also, frankly, to codify what we're doing. This is what we're doing. Let's write this down. Some of you read my Power of Stories book, which is a dissertation and theoretical, kind of, with a little practical, but this is very practical, trying to say, what are we doing and why? And so we are believing that there are 10 things that are important to create multiracial churches. I'm just going to say the 10, and then I think John and I are going to both read a little bit about something that really moves us, and then we'll do some Q&A, okay? So we think that in order to build can I step back one more second? I'm going to cough. I did not cough until I got back to New York. That means something. Hold that for me on my left. We used to feel like our call was to make sure that we can grow multiracial communities of faith. That's a good call, but that's too small. I think we feel like our call is to grow a multi-ethnic, multi-religious movement for love and justice across the nation. And we're not in that by ourselves. We're in it with Jews in LA and Buddhists in, San Francisco and Muslims in Chicago. We are part of a movement through the Auburn Senior Fellows, through William Barber's organizing. Lots of connective tissue, but it's not big enough to say multi-ethnic congregation. It has to be a movement. We have to be in a river. We have to be connected to people outside of us. So we think these 10 things work both for middle, but also for the movement that we're describing. Does that make sense, what I'm saying? Okay, so what do? We think we need to be, to embrace that we're all called to it. That being a human being, not being a Christian, but being a human being, means about being in this movement. How are we going to live if we don't work together on making the planet better? 2, we think we have to have the capacity to cast a vision for this work in the relationships in which we find ourselves. So in our congregations, at school, in our communities. We have to be able to manage change and resistance because folk don't necessarily want to change, and they will resist you. Status quo might be stinky, but it's comfortable. 4, and it says creating a congregational identity, but creating an institutional identity. Who are we? And knowing who we are says who we are, but it also says who we're not. Capacities, new and different capacities are needed to do these multi-ethnic, multi-racial, interfaith movements. How do you stick around people that are not just like you? And how do you create shared vision and values when you have all that diversity? We have to cultivate community. So people have to rely on each other, love each other, think kindly of each other to do this hard work. Celebrating in worship, ritual, fun, dance, party, all that's important. Understanding conflict, because, hello, wherever there's 2 or more ideas, there's conflict. That's in the Bible, not really, but wherever there are 2 or more ideas, so also there shall be conflict. We wrote about communicating and organizing. How do you pull people along with you? What does it mean to listen for the opposing view? How do you build a coalition? And finally, collaborating in the public square. How do we get this stuff outside of the box and into the atmosphere? So those are the things that we wrote about, and John is going to read some to you, and I'll hold the water.
In preface to this reading, I want to acknowledge Jackie and I had a lot of conversations along the way in writing this book. If you read through the book, you'll see there's very little fluff in it. It's pretty direct and stays on task. But one of the things we discussed is the fact that not everybody is ready for this, becoming this multicultural, multiracial, diverse congregation. And in fact, we acknowledge that the historic Black church still serves a very important purpose in the culture, as does the Hispanic church and the Korean church particularly. And that is, it serves as a very safe place in what can be a very hostile culture. And so we certainly acknowledge and honor those congregations and the work they do and the service they provide for their unique, particular ethnic group or cultural group. But we are advocating, as this culture grows more and more diverse, there are more and more people moving away from the earlier generational paradigm and are ready to come together in a setting of difference. And are looking for a place that can offer that. And so these are this is sort of the frame that we're looking at in the book. So I'll read just a little bit of a section here talking about call and commitment.
From chapter 1.
From chapter 1. While much has changed since the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, much has not. In fact, it can be argued that ground has been lost in the fight for justice and equality. Voter suppression, the gerrymandering of voting districts, school resegregation, and school-to-prison pipeline, and the broad-brush demonization of immigrants, refugees, and non-Christian populations are battle lines in the fight for justice and equality. Addressing the potentially controversial issues of race, class, gender, national origin, and religious practice is urgent work. This book is a call to the non-involved, play-it-safe church to engage in its own work of education, dialogue, advocacy, and action to set right the divisions cutting across this country. It is also a call to every congregation to work for inclusion and equality, to respect the value and uniqueness of every person and culture, and to commit to reaching across the dividing line separating us into groups based on the color of our skin, the accents in our speech, and our national origins. In our current political climate, there is a real threat of being dragged backward from the vision of a just, free, and inclusive society. The church must have a voice that advocates for justice, equality, and inclusion. Prayer will not be nearly enough. Since the civil rights movement, we have seen legislation passed and subverted, progress made and reversed. We have seen the stop and frisk and stand your ground policies take their toll on people of color. We have awakened to the prejudicial application of drug laws, resulting in far higher incarceration rates for people of color than whites for the same offense. And we have had the curtain pulled back on the school-to-prison pipeline. If we ever question the depths of division in this country, we need do so no longer. The nation's demographic shift and accompanying backlash, coupled with the economic anxiety among lower and middle-class whites, has fomented what can be argued as a crisis in race relations, class, and cultural differences. Some feel that white supremacy is now on full display in many parts of the country. And by the way, among all the news items was an incident here in New York over the past week where someone objected to hearing a language other than English spoken in a restaurant and made quite a scene about it. There is a rise in hate speech and hate crimes against Muslims, Mexicans, Jews, and the LGBT community. A culture of violence against minorities, especially against people of color, has become normative in the minds of many, and unprovoked police shootings of unarmed African Americans has led the news cycle on too many days. There is strong evidence that as we have neared the tipping point toward becoming a society with no ethnic majority, we see a rising up of political populism, a call for the abandonment of political correctness, and a crisis of national identity based on race and xenophobia. Some are asking, who are we if we are not predominantly white, Christian, free of the burden of having to navigate the complexities and diversity and justice for all? So we're trying to make the point here that what's going on in the larger culture resides within much of the church as well. And so we need to get honest about that and really sit down and have the tough conversations we need to look at how we behave in the world as the church and what's called for now, given the shifting realities of the world around us. And there is a great pushback on it. We see it daily in the news, and we see it personally in relationships in our own families. I've got one of those families where I'm often the voice of the outlier, where there's deep anxiety, resentment, fear, and denial about what's happening around us, and we have to speak into that as best we can. So I'll stop with that reading for the time being.
Thank you, love. Thank you for that. So I wrote, one of the chapters I enjoyed writing, the chapter on worship, because I think you know Middle Family, that we think worship is subversive, and we think it's community organizing, and we try to use today was an example of trying to use as many languages as we can, so that we can draw as many people as we can into this movement for love and justice. But let me read instead from the chapter on communicating and organizing, and it starts actually with the story of Pentecost. So I won't read that, but let me just say, let me go from here. Deeds of power. They could hear the deeds of power, God's deeds of power in their own language. What does that mean? In our holy imagination, we believe that multiracial, multicultural gathering of humanity heard the disciples tell stories about God as liberator, God as waymaker, God as healer, God as heart fixer, God as justice worker. They heard the disciples testify that in the midst of the horrible oppression at the hands of the Roman Empire, with evidence of the most despicable behavior by the emperor and his cabinet, in the midst of corruption and erosion of human rights, as an assault on the most vulnerable and marginalized, trampling on the souls of the dispossessed in the name of empire. Those disciples told stories of the dream of God, of the reign of God, already in the midst of them, creating heaven on earth. In other words, what was the content of those sermons? What were they saying? Deeds of power. This is what we imagine. The disciples told stories of truth, of empathy and resistance. They told stories of God's ability to heal the world. We believe leaders need to be able to story God's vision for a healed and whole world in as many cultural languages as possible, so that people can understand it, hear it, see it, and see how this vision fits for their lives, how they're a part of the vision. I'm alluding here to Howard Gardner's Leading Minds. Wonderful book, should be on everybody's shelf, but his basic premise is that leaders tell stories that change the story. Leaders tell compelling stories that can wrestle with the story already in the mind of followers. So I'm saying that's what these disciples were doing. They were telling these stories, testifying, so to speak, in many languages. This is evangelical, I'm saying. This is what evangelical means. It means to tell the good news of God's deeds of power in all the languages we know, in all the ways we can, by any means necessary. Pentecostal, quote, unquote, means to us in the way of Pentecost, with the primary gift being the gift of varied speech, so that all who listen can hear what God is saying to them. You are mine, you are loved, you are called. Let's get busy. A pretty simple gospel message. You are mine, you are loved, you are called. Let's get busy. So rather than have a clergy person assigned to evangelism, Middle created the position of Director of Communications. Do you remember how long ago we did that, Danita? Scott Cocking, remember? Long time ago. Oh my God, like a million years ago. Tom, right? We were like, evangelism, we can't use that word. But we thought in New York, communication is what we're doing. We believe today's church needs to think of evangelism as a project of communication and organizing. That project is both internal and external. We're storying, making that a verb, we're storying the vision that God calls us to inside our community, outside our community, to the community we intend to recruit, and those people on the border. So that's a Donald Winnicott concept, inside, outside, and on the border. The people that are already in here, we might think they're converted, so to speak, but no, people still need to be trained, and what's the reason, and why are we doing that, and what does that look like, and right? That's why we got fabulous teachers like Catherine. What are we trying to do? The people that are outside, listening to worship online, 174,000 people came to the conference online. 174 unique click-ins. How do we communicate to them? How do we evangelize them? How do we organize them into this kind of movement that is interreligious, multi-faith, multi-ethnic, all gender loving? You know, that's our project. So I call this capacity the work we need to do on the border. The people inside needing to be trained, the people outside needing to be drawn in, and then there's the border space. The people who are on the edge, or the people who are kind of curious about us, but not really plugged in. The people who join the church and might go out the back door. But enlarging that border space, to do a little Winnicott again, the place of play, the place of play, the place of innovation, the place of creativity, that border is huge. That's all of America. That's the globe. That's so many people to pull into this conversation. So I want to quickly say that this chapter talks about being on the border and developing border capacities. It talks about W.E.B. Du Bois's two-ness as a gift. Black folks in America, a book from the soul of black folks, having a veil or a two-ness, the ability to both see with African American eyes, but also to understand the white gaze. I'm paraphrasing that some, but that idea of both and, that we need that as a capacity on the border. My blackness on the border, but also the white me. And I said that one time and somebody got mad, so let me be clear what I mean. I can't be in America and be black and not have a white me. I've had to code switch since I was able to first talk. Y'all with me? That's what I'm talking about. That's what Du Bois meant. And that's what I'm saying. And it could be a curse or it's a gift. And just to push it, if white people would ever feel like they need to code switch, if white people would ever want to get on the border and be thinking about what does that mean and develop border capacities, what a different world it would be. That's what I'm talking about in this chapter, that all of us get to the border and we build skills and capacities. We read literature that we would never read. We listen to music we would never pick. We read theology that is not white men, old white guys theology. We get ourselves into some womanist talk and some feminist talk, and we get ourselves into some mujerista thinking. We who are Christian read Buddhist literature. We who are Jewish read African American theologians. We who think Jews are just Christians without Jesus get it together and know that that's not true. All of these are the projects that are our projects. Yeah, I'll stop there. You want to do a little more?
I'll share a little more, a couple of shorter readings. One of the things I tried to tackle here is the sense of calling to this task. How do we talk about that? What's our language for talking about that? And then what is our prophetic role as a faith community? So let me see where to begin. Ministry has often been defined as categorically different from occupational choice or even vocational pursuit. Rooted not in cultural expectations, for productivity, but in ancient religious story and metaphor, ministry is entered into as a calling. The calling is born of a tradition of priest and prophet, of one chosen to speak for God, to protect and administer the moral code of personal and corporate conduct, to define the believer's relationship to the holy, and to articulate revealed truth as a way to advance human community. We experience this calling so profoundly that we have no choice but to say yes to it, even when we feel inadequate to the task, even when doing so can jeopardize our security, our peace of mind, and our physical comfort. In the broadest terms, our call embraces advocating for those on the margins, the poor, the vulnerable, and those treated unjustly. Captured in biblical text and story is the mandate to address issues of injustice and oppression, to seek the common good, to seek to bring harmony to all that is broken and at odds with God's vision for human community. The act of committing to this calling and being claimed by it brings us to experience the utter defeat of personal agendas and private aspirations. Our response to this sense of call results in making commitments capable of depleting the very soul that yesterday it caused to soar. To honor this calling is to be alternately stretched and blessed, affirmed and challenged, nurtured by renewing waters and driven into the desert. It is to live with absolute certainty one moment and complete vulnerability the next. It is to identify oneself with the greatest of all hopes in the face of the greatest of all possible disillusionments. Living out this calling means journeying on the coattails of a promise as elusive as the evening mist. This thing to which we're called can often feel like standing on shaky ground. It does require risk-taking. It does require stepping out into the midst of the congregation or the community and speaking one's truth. A little bit about the prophetic role. Multiracial, multicultural faith communities also have a unique prophetic role in the larger society. In his book, The Prophetic Imagination, Walter Brueggemann states, "The task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant community or culture around us." End of his quote. It is out of this alternative consciousness that the faith community finds its identity and defines its purpose. In this sense, in every aspect, the faith community is subversive in its relationship to the dominant culture and is not beguiled by the culture's claims of affinity with the faith community, illustrated by the words "In God We Trust" imprinted on the coin of the realm. Distinguishing ourselves from the culture is an ongoing task because the culture is ready to co-opt us at every turn in the road. And so being aware of that and awake to that is an important part of what it means for a faith community to move in the world. Have one's eyes open and know that in every political sense you are looked at as being co-opted, and one need not have to look too far to see how the church is being co-opted in many ways now today. That's probably enough. We tried to be pretty bold in our critique and pretty I guess artistic in some of our expression.
I was going to say you're a poet.
So that we gave
That's what goes on there.
Gave some ways to talk about this stuff that we often don't have, at least not readily at hand.
Two short pieces for me and then conversation with y'all. One of the things that we really also tried to do in the book was to make middle a case study, John's consulting work as case studies, but not just go, yay, this is what we did, great, because we learned from our mistakes. And I told the story of Black Lives Matter. And some of you hadn't joined the church yet when I got my butt kicked by some of y'all about Black Lives Matter, but it was a tough moment for a little bit. And it was, we were on fire with Eric Garner and Michael Brown and all that, and I assumed that middle was on board, just on board. Like I just assumed middle understood what we meant by Black Lives Matter. And in fact, Gloria, you show up in this chapter as my hero, frankly. So I hope it's okay, I'm gonna read just a little bit of it, but I say, though Middle had been committed to multiracial, multicultural, intentional work in community for 3 decades, the context of American life shifted around us. The election of Barack Hussein Obama caused some parts of America to claim a post-racial reality, and others to bring their racism and homophobia out of hiding. The onslaught of murders of Black people at the hands of law enforcement reached epic proportions. And you all know the names: Michael Brown, Eric Garner, Tanisha Anderson, Tamir Rice, 12-year-old Ayanna Stanley Brown, killed on her mother's couch, her grandmother's couch, when a TV show was being shot, a cop TV show being shot in their house, and she was killed. So when I started saying Black Lives Matter here in the congregation, I took for granted that we all knew what it meant. And I had some really important questions and some really important pushback. Do all lives matter? What do we mean by Black Lives Matter? But what does that mean? What does that mean? And I write, quote, I took the criticism as an opportunity to teach. I realized that I was taking for granted that Middle Church understood the Black Lives Matter movement, and they were clear about why the movement existed and what it purposed to do. I took for granted that my preaching was enough background to bring them with me, and I was wrong. So I dropped back. I took a little time off. I put Black Lives Matter on the shelf for a couple months. I don't know if you noticed, but I know I did. And I did 2 things. First, I preached about vision instead, reminding us what our vision was. And then I reminded us of our identity and our history, that we are the church that opened our arms to folks dying with HIV/AIDS, offering comfort, a heart meal, support, and spaces for grieving those who died. I reminded us that while 11 o'clock is the most segregated hour in other congregations, it's not here at Middle Church, and to whom much is given, much is required. And then I supplemented what I was doing in worship with adult education. We started the Racial Task Force, in part because of that. We had some great conversations about race that helped plant more seeds about what Black Lives Matter means. And then I got clear and made it clear, this is where Gloria is my hero. She and I had a really great meeting, a great conversation about this. And Gloria, remember we went to that UU church where we all sang? The gospel choir was singing, you said, I got it, But you didn't get it just because I was preaching, right? You got it because also conversations and classes. And what I say here is, we began to understand that Black Lives Matter is the last phrase of a larger paragraph. And the larger paragraph is, when Black lives matter, when Black children live as long as their white counterparts, when Black mortality rates are lower, when Black HIV infection rates and incarceration rates are more in line with statistics for white people, when the wealth gap between whites and Blacks is reduced to 0, when voting rights are not eroded, when law enforcement officers are indicted for killing Black people, then Black lives will truly matter. Because Black lives matter, all people will matter, because Black people are among the least of these in the United States. So when Black lives matter, all lives matter. That was such an important learning for me, that the pulpit isn't so this is still in the chapter of community organizing. Communication can't just be in the pulpit, it's got to be many faceted, many ways, multiple pronged, and repeated over and over again. And lastly, just a little quick piece on theology in public. Because I think this is in chapter 9. Is it John or chapter 10? It's chapter 10. I have a new job description in which the board is really thinking of me as a public theologian. Yay! But you also are public theologians. Everybody in this room, which is the sermon I was preaching today. All of you, in your sphere of influence, at the dinner table, in your artwork, in your painting, in your organizing, in your teaching, in your writing, in your therapy, in your girls club, in your on the picket line, everything you do. I can list all of your vocations, moms and dads. You are a public theologian. You are teaching the world what you think about God by the way you do and the way you be and what you say. So just a little bit on that. When people push you back, when they say, you're too political, here's what you're going to say. Jesus was a public theologian. Yes, he spent time in temple, but most of what is recorded in his ministry happened outside. Almost all of it happened outdoors. Second, he was political, embroiled in a theological political battle with corrupt religious authorities of his own faith and with Rome, both of his own faith and with Rome. 3, he understood the power of a good story. The parables are such an example. And 4th, he understood the power of an ethical spectacle. I mean, what? That temple tantrum? Throwing tables around? Cursing the fig tree for not being productive? That was kind of mean, but it was drama, right, Harold? A little drama. Finally, he was the theologian in residence of his movement. The theologian of residence in his movement. So wherever you're at, parenting books, or Dominic and Carlo, or organizing with immigrants' rights, or being everywhere you are the resident theologian. Even those of us who are not sure we believe in God, you're the resident ethicist. You're the resident philosopher. So what you do, what you say, how you be, you're movement building all the time.